In the early 1950s, the British railway companies, facing what they did not yet fully understand as the final years of steam locomotive dominance, made a series of decisions that, in retrospect, appear almost poignant in their attachment to a technology that was about to be rendered obsolete. The railway companies ordered new steam locomotives, some of them representing the finest achievement of steam locomotive engineering that had ever been developed. These orders were placed not in defiance of the inevitable change to diesel, but in a kind of studied blindness to what was coming. The railways could see diesel locomotives operating on other railways. They could see that diesel was more economical. They could see that the future was shifting. But they ordered new steam locomotives anyway, ordered them in quantity, ordered them designed to the highest standards, as if the commitment to steam on a large scale was still the appropriate response to the transportation challenges that the railways faced. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the situation that British railways faced in the early 1950s. The railway system had been devastated by the Second World War. The infrastructure had been damaged or deferred in maintenance for years. The locomotives in service were aging, many of them pre-war designs that had been pushed hard during the war and that were approaching the end of their useful lives. The railway needed motive power. The railway needed it urgently. The question was, what kind of motive power to invest in, and how quickly to make the transition, if a transition was going to happen at all. Diesel locomotives were operating in other parts of the world. American railways were transitioning to diesel. European railways were experimenting with diesel and electric traction. But in Britain, the situation was different. Britain had coal. Britain had built its industrial power on coal. The steam locomotive industry, which had been centered in Britain for more than a century, represented British industrial achievement and British technical competence. To abandon steam seemed, to many people in positions of authority, like a repudiation of British industrial capability. But beyond the economic nationalism that influenced the decision, there was a more fundamental uncertainty about which technology would ultimately prove superior for British railway operation. American railways were going diesel, but American railways operated under different conditions, served different markets, had different operational requirements than British railways. It was not obvious that what made sense for American railways would make sense for Britain. The comparison between diesel and steam was not a simple one. Diesel offered advantages in terms of fuel efficiency and reduced maintenance requirements, but steam was better understood. The infrastructure to support steam was in place. The men who worked on railways understood steam. The uncertainty about the future was genuine. So the decision that the British railway companies made was to order new steam locomotives, to build them to the highest standards, to invest in the technology that they understood, while leaving open the possibility of a transition to diesel at some future point, when the economics became clearer, and when the technical advantages of diesel were more demonstrable. It was a decision that looked, in 1950, like the right decision. It looked like the prudent response to genuine uncertainty about what the future should be. The decision only looked mistaken in retrospect. When the transition to diesel had become inevitable, and when it became clear that the investment in new steam locomotives in the early 1950s had been wasted money, spent on machines that would operate for only a decade before being scrapped. The locomotive at the center of this story was one of these final expressions of steam locomotive excellence, a machine built in 1956, when the end of steam was perhaps less than 15 years away, though nobody involved in its construction could have known that with certainty. The locomotive was designed to be the ultimate express passenger engine, a machine that would represent everything that British steam locomotive engineering had learned, that would haul the fastest and most prestigious trains that the railway operated, that would do all of this with an elegance and a power that would demonstrate to everyone, to the railway company and to the public and to the men who worked on the railways, that steam was still capable of accomplishing extraordinary things. The design that emerged from the engineering process was magnificent. The locomotive incorporated the latest improvements in boiler design, in valve gear configuration, in the subtle aerodynamic refinements that could squeeze additional performance from the fundamental limitations of steam power. The locomotive was not experimental. It was not a radical innovation. It was instead a refinement, a culmination, the product of a century of incremental improvement applied to a basic design concept that had been refined to near perfection. The locomotive was powerful enough to haul the heaviest express trains. It was fast enough to maintain the schedules that the railway's most prestigious services required. It was efficient enough that the economics of operating it were defensible, at least compared to the economics of other steam locomotives. The engineers who designed the locomotive understood that they were working in a tradition that was being challenged, but that still had value. They looked at the diesel locomotives that were operating on other railways, and they understood what diesel was offering. But they also understood what steam was still capable of offering, what refinements could still be applied, what performance could still be extracted from the technology. The decision to design a new steam locomotive in the mid-1950s was not a decision born of ignorance. It was a decision made by men who understood the competitive situation and who chose to design and build anyway, chosen to express what they believed steam could still accomplish. The construction of the locomotive was carried out to the highest standards. The workmen who built the machine were skilled craftsmen, men who had spent their working lives learning the trade of building steam locomotives. They understood what they were building. They understood that machines like this one were becoming rarer, that the era of steam locomotive construction was approaching its end, that the opportunity to apply their craft to machines of this quality was going to become increasingly scarce. The locomotive was built with care, with attention to quality, with the understanding that this was work that mattered, that would be remembered, that represented the culmination of a tradition. What made the locomotive historically significant was not any single technical achievement. What made it significant was the context of its construction, the specific moment in railway history when it was built. The locomotive was being built at a moment when its own obsolescence was already predetermined, when the railway company that ordered it and the manufacturer that built it both understood, at some level, that the diesel transition was coming, that the future belonged to electric and diesel traction, and that steam locomotives, no matter how well engineered, would eventually disappear. The decision to build the locomotive was made by men who had spent their entire careers in the railway industry, who had grown up in steam, who had built their professional identities around the understanding of steam locomotive operation and design. These were not men who were denying the reality of change. These were men who understood that change was coming, but who believed that there was still value in building the finest steam locomotive that could be built, that the commitment to excellence was justified even if the technology was approaching the end of its dominance. The locomotive was built, and when it entered service, it did everything that its designers had hoped it would do. It hauled the express trains reliably. It maintained the schedules. It attracted admiration from people who cared about railways, people who could see that this was a machine built at a level of refinement that represented the culmination of a technological era. Photographers and railway enthusiasts recognized that they were looking at something significant, that this was a locomotive that mattered not because it was revolutionary, but because it represented the highest achievement of a technology that was approaching its end. The locomotive operated for only a few years before the diesel transition accelerated. The railway made the decision to move toward diesel electrification, and the plans for new steam locomotives were cancelled. The express locomotive that had been ordered as the next generation of the railway's mainline power was superseded by machines designed for the different operational paradigm that diesel offered. The locomotive continued to operate, continued to haul trains, continued to perform reliably, but it was no longer part of the future. It was part of the past, a monument to an approach to railway operation that had been decided against. What happened to the men who maintained and operated the locomotive was part of the larger story of the transition. The men who had been trained to work with steam locomotives discovered that their skills were becoming obsolete, that the work that had defined their careers was disappearing. The transition from steam to diesel was not kind to the men who had built their professional lives around steam. The knowledge they carried was specific to steam operation. It did not transfer easily to diesel. The jobs that had been available in steam locomotive maintenance were eliminated as the steam fleet was withdrawn. The apprenticeships that had trained new men in the craft of steam locomotive work were ended. The express locomotive that was built in 1956 represented, for the men who built it and who worked with it, a kind of coda to their working lives. The men who designed it were near the end of their careers. The men who built it were doing work that they knew would be their last expressions of the craft they had learned. The men who operated and maintained it were working with a machine that represented the peak of what steam could accomplish, even though they knew that steam was ending. The express locomotive was, in a sense, a gift that the engineers and the craftsmen gave to themselves and to the industry, a final expression of their skill before the transition that would end their careers as they had known them. The significance of the locomotive lies in what it reveals about the nature of technological transition, about the way that industries make decisions about abandoning old technologies, about the complex psychology of people who work with a technology that is dying. The railway companies that built new steam locomotives in the early 1950s were not denying that diesel was the future. What they were doing was choosing to make one final expression of steam excellence, choosing to build machines that represented what steam could accomplish at its highest level before the transition to diesel became complete and comprehensive. This choice tells us something important about what people value in technology, beyond mere functionality. The men who built the express locomotive were not naive. They understood the competitive advantages of diesel. They understood that the transition was coming, but they also understood that there was value in craftsmanship, in excellence, in building a machine that represented the achievement of a technology pushed to its limits. They were building a masterpiece, and they were doing so with full knowledge that the masterpiece would be a masterpiece of a dying form. When historians look at this locomotive today, it is recognized as something special, as one of the last great expressions of steam locomotive engineering, as a machine built at a moment of transition, as a vehicle that carried with it an entire technological culture that was about to disappear. The locomotive was not the most powerful ever built. It did not set records for speed or efficiency that surpassed machines that came before it. What the locomotive did was represent the possibility of excellence within a tradition, the commitment to doing something as well as it could possibly be done, even though the larger context in which it was being done was changing. The story of the express locomotive reveals something that technological history sometimes obscures. The transition from one technology to another is not always driven purely by the superiority of the new technology. Sometimes it is driven by economics, by the cost advantage that the new technology provides. Sometimes it is driven by the infrastructure that has been built around the new technology, by the network effects that make the new technology more valuable as more organizations adopt it. The transition to diesel from steam was driven by these factors, by the genuine economic advantage of diesel operation, by the infrastructure that had been built to support diesel, by the momentum that diesel had accumulated. But the transition also involved a kind of cultural loss. The men who understood steam locomotive operation, who carried the knowledge of how to work with these machines, who had built their professional lives around the technology, were not simply replaced by men who understood diesel. The knowledge was lost. The practices that had evolved over a century were abandoned. The tradition of craftsmanship that had produced machines like the express locomotive was ended, not because it was no longer technically sophisticated, but because the economics and the trajectory of the industry were pointing in a different direction. The express locomotive that was built in 1956 was operated until the mid-1960s, when the diesel transition accelerated and when the railway companies began withdrawing steam locomotives in larger numbers. The locomotive was scrapped. Like most steam machines, its metal returned to industrial use. Its specific identity and its historical significance rendered invisible by the fact of its destruction. What remained was the memory of the locomotive, the photographs that had been taken, the accounts that had been written, the knowledge that it had existed and what it had represented. Today, when railway historians discuss the late steam era in Britain, when they talk about the final expressions of steam locomotive engineering, the express locomotive is recognized as significant. It is remembered not for setting records, but for representing an era, for embodying a commitment to excellence that persisted even as the technology that excellence was applied to was being abandoned. The locomotive became, in its destruction and in its absence, more significant than it might have been if it had continued to operate, because its destruction marked an end of something, marked the passing of an era. What the express locomotive teaches us is something about how technologies die, about the complexity of technological transition, about the fact that engineering excellence and commercial viability are not always aligned. The express locomotive was excellent. It was well engineered. It represented the highest achievement of steam locomotive technology. But it was not commercially viable in the context of the 1950s, not because it failed to accomplish what it was designed to accomplish, but because the economic and technical conditions that made steam operation the preferred solution were changing faster than the railway industry wanted to acknowledge. The men who designed and built the express locomotive understood this. They were making a choice to build the finest steam locomotive that could be built, knowing that the locomotive would operate for only a limited time, knowing that the technology it represented was approaching obsolescence, choosing to build excellence anyway, because excellence was worth pursuing, even in a dying form. The locomotive that resulted from this choice is remembered as one of the last great steam locomotives, not because it was the most powerful or the fastest, but because it represented a moment of transition, a moment when an industry was choosing to acknowledge its own ending by building one final masterpiece before moving on to something else. The express locomotive was scrapped decades ago. The metal that composed it has been recycled many times over. The locomotive itself no longer exists as a physical object, but what it represented, what it embodied, what it taught about the relationship between technology and culture, continues to resonate. It was the last expression of a technological tradition, built with the knowledge that the tradition was ending, built anyway because the commitment to excellence transcended the knowledge of obsolescence. That is the significance of the locomotive built when steam was dying. It was not built to save steam. It was too late for that. The decision to transition to diesel had already been made by the time the express locomotive was being designed. The locomotive was built in the knowledge that it would operate for only a limited time, that the technology it represented would soon be abandoned, that the investment in its construction would be rendered economically obsolete by the transition that everyone understood was coming. It was built anyway, built with care and skill and resources, built to say goodbye to steam in the only way that made sense to the men who knew and cared about the technology, by building something excellent, by demonstrating that the technology still had achievement to offer, by creating a monument to what was being abandoned. The express locomotive carries forward, in historical memory and in the stories that are told about it, a reminder of what was lost when the transition from steam to diesel was complete, not in terms of the mechanical or economic advantages of one technology over another, but in terms of the traditions and the knowledge and the communities of practice that were built around the technology that was abandoned. The locomotive was scrapped, but what it represented persists in the memory of people who care about railways, who recognize that this was a machine built at a moment of transition, a machine that embodied the commitment to excellence even in the face of obsolescence. It was the last masterpiece, and its significance lies not in what it accomplished, but in what it represented about an industry and a technological era that were coming to an end, about the men who worked in that industry and who understood that their world was changing, about the choice to build excellence anyway, to pursue perfection in a craft that was being abandoned, to create one final expression of a tradition before that tradition disappeared entirely from the world. The express locomotive teaches a lesson about technological change that is often forgotten in the simple narratives of progress. The lesson that the transition from one technology to another is not always a simple matter of the better technology replacing the worse one, that there is a human dimension to technological change, that people who have built their lives around a technology do not simply abandon it when something better comes along. They may acknowledge that the better technology is coming. They may understand the economic logic of the transition, but they can still choose to build one final masterpiece, one final expression of what they know and what they value, before accepting the inevitable change. The locomotive that was built in 1956 stands now as a monument to that choice, to the decision to build excellence in the final years of a technology, to the commitment to craft and quality that transcends the knowledge of obsolescence, to the men who understood that their world was changing and who chose to express what they believed about their work through the construction of a magnificent machine.